You're listening to STP Radio. James Bach, welcome to STP Radio. I'm glad to have you jump on a call with me.
I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, very cool. For those folks that may not know, James's own background as not only one of the best contributors to our community and the disciplines and the understanding of how to do software testing, you're currently one of the leading teachers out there. Your class is probably constantly now worldwide, I understand.
I spend a lot of time teaching, yes, online and in person. Right now, I'm not home very much because of that.
Yeah, so the demand is good, but getting on Skype like we're talking on Skype right now is almost preferred because you can be home and also share your thoughts anywhere in the world with everyone else.
Yeah, it's lovely when I'm here. I get all my home services and got my dogs, and my son comes to visit, and it's great. Yeah.
Very, very cool. The way STP Radio generally works is we've just kind of kicked it off as a general podcast, but we're just to do interviews in the continuation of the Twist style. We take some questions. Mike Lyles and some of the guys had done a Ask the Tester series in article form, in long form, and converting that into a podcast just as an audio thing, we change it up a little bit where we can take almost any question from, say, a recent conference or some online topics that we have teaching on. And I pretty much volunteer my time into help teaching those kinds of things too. What we'll do is just take some of the topics and questions and I'll bounce them off of you, but we can go just about anywhere you'd like to go in the conversation.
That sounds fine. Whatever you want to talk about, I'm ready.
You're open. You're my blank canvas. You might not have heard, although it was a little bit of I wouldn't say a controversy, but at the recent STP conference, there was a keynote that was put up together between Dr. Kem Kainer and Rex Black. Rex, of course, from the ASTQB or ISTQB background, and that's the main bulk of his business in teaching. Which is different than sort of a context-driven school. I think Kem was also up kind of talking back and forth, and they were debating this sort of a topic of the schools of testing. And to some extent, just to fill in the background, because I know you weren't there. If you were there, we would have really delved into it there, I think. But I ended up getting a lot of questions from folks about sort of how, I feel like we started in that keynote in the middle of a thought, in the middle of a debate. And what are these schools of testing, was sort of they said. And so everyone's searching on Google and they find stuff from Michael Bolton.
Yeah.
And I think it's sort of a faux debate. It was
a faux debate.
Yeah, I don't know what you would call it. Yeah, a folly.
You mean they didn't really debate?
It wasn't. Yeah, it wasn't moderated, and it wasn't sort of a point and counterpoint a way you would moderate a formal debate. It was more of it was more of a casual discussion as a keynote, but it kind of kicked things off.
My understanding is that Rex won't debate anyone really on this subject. He won't listen to me or any of my colleagues on this subject. He won't come out and fight. So we'll be happy to answer his questions, but yeah. he has excused himself from answering ours.
And therein lies some of the question that you can imagine a new tester or somebody that came to a conference and said, well, what is the sort of a mystical background mythology here that maybe we don't know?
Well, there's a history, yeah.
There is a history in not just a testing discipline or a section of our work. There's in engineering history, there's a whole history of scientific debate.
Right.
What would be your advice to a new tester on how to make sense of what are different schools, and how would you help them to make sense of this as they get started?
Well, I guess the first thing I'd say, and I say this every time I teach a class, is that there is no United Nations of testing, despite the fact that there's an organization that seems to name itself as if they were a United Nations of testing, which is the International Software Testing Qualifications Board. Play fanfare of trumpets here. It's just a group of secretive businessmen who have seized an opportunity to exploit the lack of self-awareness in the testing community of its own history and its own methods. And they have successfully exploited people into thinking that they need their silly certification. And they've successfully convinced many people that they offer some sort of, what do they say, common vocabulary, which of course is not a common vocabulary. If we all wanted a common vocabulary, you're all welcome to use my vocabulary. But unlike them, I will say that my vocabulary is my own opinion.
Sure.
And it doesn't represent any kind of effort to get all people together in testing and have them agree on what would a good vocabulary of testing be. I'm happy if people want to use my language, and they really should, because it's the best. Obviously, I think that my use of words is the best. But I'm not going to pretend. I'm not going to tell lies about my methods. So at the beginning of my classes, I say, look, there are different cultures within the software testing world. There are different schools of thought within the software testing world. There are different communities. Within the larger community of people who do testing, which is a very, very loose-knit community. But within that, there are some close-knit communities of people who are vigorously working together and trusting each other. I represent, or I am part of, one of those communities that has given itself a name, the context-driven community. And what is strange is that some of the other communities don't want to give themselves names. Well, it's not entirely strange, because I think I know why they don't want to give themselves names. They don't want to name themselves because they don't want to admit that they aren't the only community. They want everyone to believe that they're the only one, instead of seeing it as humility. It is actually a humble act to say, you know what, there's more than one way of thinking in the world. Without taking anything away from my way of thinking, which I obviously think is the best, I cannot in good conscience say or make the claim that I'm the only way of thinking, that my thinking represents the only one. And I think that if we're going to have peace, it's got to begin with acknowledging that there are different ways of thinking. And that's really what the schools of software testing are. To me, it's almost laughably silly when someone says, I don't think there are schools, because all I have to say is, well, I think there are. See, there's two schools right there. The school of thought that there are and the school of thought that there aren't. All we're saying is that there are different groups of people, clumps of thinkers who have different philosophies, and within each community you can make certain assumptions. You don't have to explain certain things, but when you talk between those communities, you cannot make certain assumptions because they do not follow between the communities. So if anyone wants to be a serious student of software testing, then just like as if you're going to be a serious student of religion or a serious student of politics or a serious student of music or anything else, or statistics, there are at least two schools of thoughts in statistics, the frequentists and the Bayesians. And if you want to be a serious student of statistics, then you better know that, or you won't be considered a very serious student. And so that's the first thing I'd say, is that there are different communities. I want to recruit all the smart people into my community, and I think that my community has a lot to offer smart people, people who enjoy using their brains, and we consider ourselves, the readers. We're the people who. The context-driven world is the part of the world we read about the history of science, we read about the sociology of science, and we apply those lessons. So I'm applying a book called How to Use Your Eyes, which is written by an art historian, to the problem of software testing. And we're bringing new ideas into software testing. It seems to me, looking at it mostly from the outside, but it seems to me that the factory school of testing, which is where I put It's what I call the school that Rex represents, the school that would love to treat testing as if it were a factory mechanizable process, which to me is no insult at all. I mean, factories are very useful entities that have done a lot. It's not an unreasonable thing to try to pursue a factory idea, except for the fact that I think it doesn't work at all. But, I mean, it's not inherently unreasonable to try to pursue that. But I look at the factory school people, which dominate the world right now, and it seems to me that they have no new ideas. They haven't had a new idea in 30 years.
Yeah, one thing that I heard from attendees at the conference was sort of, should I make sense of the ISTQB in a way that it's sort of beginners versus advanced? I didn't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
I would say it's suckers versus students. That's how I would look at it.
Okay.
I think that the ISTQB is an organization that exploits the ignorance and fear of people. What they've done is they've swept together a bunch of ideas that were already out there. They're already on the net. If it wasn't for the ISTQB, people would have the internet, and they'd have all the stuff that's out there for free. They'd have all the testing textbooks that had already been written. There's no innovation there.
Yep.
They've plucked a bunch of ideas. They've put it together into this sort of shepherd's pie, but the pieces don't fit. They have not subjected their syllabus to critical thinking. In fact, they run from critical thinking. They run from debate. They refuse to debate us.
Yeah, real debate, I think.
Real debate. Rex has been, and his crew have been repeatedly challenged on Twitter to support their claims with evidence, and they refuse to do it. They just say, "Oh, you guys are a bunch of haters." Oh, I'm sure glad scientists don't in general have that attitude. In the context-driven world, we are trying to model ourselves around the culture of good scientists, and we want to be self-critical. We want to engage in vigorous debate. And there are people who can't handle, or they don't like the icky feeling they get when their ideas are challenged. But whether I like it or not, the kinds of colleagues that I respect and hang out with, they require me to answer for my ideas in debate, and I am not allowed to turn away from that. If I turn away from that, then I lose my standing in the community. It's the same way that you can't be a world champion tennis player if you refuse to play tennis with anyone. You have to defend your Wimbledon crown in the next year's tournament, and if you turn away from that, that's fine. But you've retired from tennis. That's what they call that.
Yeah.
When you do that,
and you don't just show up at the last game and play once. You have to play the whole tournament again, all the way from the bottom.
It's not quite like the America's Cup. Yeah, it's
they make you prove it.
Right. They make you prove it from the bottom, and that's the kind of world that a community that I want to be in, is a kind of community that keeps me sharp, that keeps challenging me. Now, that's not to say that I'll accept any crazy challenge from every novice tester who says, "How do I know that gravity really exists?" If you're a physicist and someone says, "How do you know that it's not all based on chickens? Chickens rule the earth. Chickens control physics." You don't necessarily have to answer every astrologer that comes along, but I do answer for my ideas from any serious person who challenges, and I've made many challenges to the ISTQB. I and my community, we've published our challenges, and we're just ignored. And it's unfortunate, but that's really evidence that there are schools, because when a person in one school challenges someone in another school, the schools tend to ignore each other.
Yeah. If I hear what you're saying correctly, sort of the divide comes from exactly my question, which was sort of how would a new tester make sense of that? And even though there's some humor in saying, there's suckers versus students, to some extent, there is sort of the certified or factory world that you don't have that much respect for because they kind of just seem to be taking advantage of a business opportunity, or they're not really telling a new tester, you can go further than this.
They're simply not thinkers. They are not thinkers. They are not students of the craft. They cannot hold their ground when they are challenged. They do not deserve our respect. You must earn respect. You can't just say, well, I've been in this business for 20 years, and that qualifies me to say that this works for me. I just argued with a guy at a conference, a guy named Jeff Horn, who will say this. He speaks a lot. And his big comeback is, well, this is what works for me, and I've been in the business for 25 years or whatever. And what I keep telling him is that's not good enough, Jeff. That's not good enough. Have him on your show, have him answer my criticisms. He will say, he just was telling me, oh, you people in the context-driven world, you're so rigid, and you always think you're right. Well, we have arguments and evidence in our favor. If you want to gain our respect and get us to think differently, why don't you use argument and evidence instead of just saying, I just feel that this is true. I just like doing what I'd like to do. You can do whatever you like. Just don't expect to get respected if you don't earn it. And if in fact you refuse on principle to earn it, like someone who's just entitled because you've been hanging around and you didn't get fired, and that means that your work is good. Whenever somebody says, "I've done this for years and it's worked," I go, "Really? Does that really mean you've done it for years and you haven't gotten fired? Is that really all there is to it when you say it worked?"
Well, there's actually at the heart of that the contextual thinking. What's the context for you succeeding for 20-some years? The context could be it wasn't much of a challenge, or it's kind of you're not really pushing yourself to learn more or be, like you say, a true student of the craft.
It could be. It could actually be that the practices being discussed are actually very nice in that context and were appropriately chosen. And the thing is that if that's true, then you ought to be able to explain them. You ought to be able to say, this is exactly why this can work. This is why this is an ethical practice. And it's not just survival bias. Survival bias is the bias of people who survived. I prayed to Odin and I didn't die, so that must mean that my prayers to Odin worked. Well, how many other people prayed to Odin and did die?
Or gravity exists because chickens can't fly. Therefore, I survived because I agreed that chickens, and I've lived my life based on chickens not flying as the proof of gravity, and that's worked for me, so I'll stick with that.
Right. I'm just speaking up for basic and advanced critical thinking about what we're doing. And when someone says, don't yell at me, it's just a matter of opinion, I'm not comfortable with that. It's not just a matter of opinion. It's a matter of evidence and reason. And we've got to follow that, I believe. That's the scientific way, and I don't think science is something arbitrary. Science is what created all the technology that we are now speaking through.
And enjoying in modern life, or debating its ethical basis in modern life.
That's right. So, I'm sorry if I sound grumpy, but it's just the fact is I'm very grumpy about this. I'm sick of of all this. I'm having the same arguments today that I've had 25 years ago. It's the same argument, except I'm older, and now I know I'm right instead of thinking that I'm right 25 years ago. I have 25 years of more evidence and an example that I can give. And my work has changed in the last 25 years. I actually heard that. I heard that once as an argument against what I do. Someone said that it was because I kept changing that showed that my ideas were bad, that because I keep changing them. Whereas the ideas that are good are the ones that haven't changed, the ones that haven't changed in 40 years.
Yeah, the best business advice I ever received from my stepfather years ago was the definition of failure is the inability to adapt in the face of new information. And if you think of a scientific method in terms of constantly questioning and developing new information, then you have to constantly be able to adapt. And it doesn't mean, the way I understand it now in my own 20-some years of working, it doesn't mean you adapt yourself out of a career or out of a job. In some cases, I was very happy to say, this is all new information and you guys don't need me anymore. And I had to find another job. But you know what? That's the way life goes. That's the way careers go. But I also sense a bit in your perspective, aside from being grumpy, there's a sense of something built in that's a little bit of humility. Your experience has led you to not seek to cling to one, like a factory style or one way of doing something. It's adapting the way you do things and being open to not abandoning a standard which worked in the manufacturing era, the industrial era, for the history of business, if you think of it that way. The future of what we're doing in science is different than sort of the business relationship to what we're doing in that science. So what I guess I'm trying to ask is how much does adaptability require or is predicated upon some sense of humility in what you're doing in testing?
Well, epistemic humility, which is the kind of humility that says, I may not know enough, I might not know the truth, is absolutely vital to the practice of testing. Without this, we wouldn't even do testing. It is vital to being a student at a high level in any art, any discipline. At the same time, you must combine that with a sort of confidence. You must have a combination, an alloy of confidence, sort of an emulsion, I guess, of confidence and a certain kind of humility, or else you'll simply stop learning. So I have a kind of humility in the sense that I have a great nervousness that someone will discover that I'm wrong about something important before I do.
Sure.
And then they'll reveal it to me in some inopportune moment. So what I do to protect myself against that is, apart from constantly scanning my own beliefs in the face of demonstrations and watching people test and asking myself, can I explain every single thing that I'm seeing? Is there anything here that seems odd? Anything here that doesn't match my theory? And in addition to doing that, I also try to surround myself with critical thinkers who are willing to engage with me, who are willing to challenge in some meaningful way. I wouldn't even say I need constructive criticism. I think constructive criticism is for the weak. I don't care whether it's constructive or destructive. What I care is whether it's meaningful. Meaningful criticism, even delivered in a way that doesn't help my feelings feel good, is criticism that will help me survive. It will help me be better. And that's my biggest concern, is that I don't wake up one day and realize I've been a fool, for 10 years. So I try to surround myself with people who are going to notice the problems in my work. I get my work reviewed. Most of my work is reviewed by one of these people before I publish it. And if I find a mistake in my work, I try to correct it quickly, although there actually are a lot of things that I've published that have mistakes in them that it's too overwhelming to fix all the old mistakes. So I just rely on the fact that, well, that's old, so it's like historical evidence.
Yeah, and if someone asked me today to account for that, one of the first things you could say was, well, got to say it wasn't perfect back then. Like any thought, here's what I've learned since then.
So I have one document which just shows the evolution of definitions of exploratory testing, which shows the history of every definition I tried, and I wrote most of the definitions of exploratory testing that are out there, and I keep tinkering with it, and I think it's useful for people to see how that has evolved, because I want every young brain out there to think I can make an important contribution to this craft. If this craft is growing and changing, maybe I can find something new in it and be responsible for leading the craft to its next stage. And we've got some very big challenges in testing now that we need a lot of help getting over these challenges that we have today. So I'm recruiting and encouraging as many young thinkers as possible to come into the craft. That requires humility right there, because we're talking about people who are 20 years younger than me at this point, and I have to swallow hard and realize that one of these people could point out something that I haven't noticed. And that's hard to think about, but at the same time, I console myself with the fact that, well, at least I'll learn and get better. And
part of the idea of, in my time or in your time, I've taken us this far as you look at the evolution. I remember the three-legged stool models and the H word, the heuristical word in the background, and I think that's part of the what became now the pedagogy for teaching exploratory testing is the entire evolution that arrives this point, which is the rapid software testing. I think the latest version of it.
Yeah, and that yes, and here's a little bit that's just recently hit us who are working with rapid software testing, is we realize that we can, for a lot of things, we can just say when we have a new idea, we'll just say, this is how in rapid software testing, which is sort of a school within a school, in rapid software testing, we say this is our definition of a test case. And that means I can share the definition of test case that I think is right. And if someone says, well, I disagree with that or I don't like that, and we go, well, that's fine. It's just the rapid software testing methodology definition of a test case. You don't have to agree with it at all. Meanwhile, feel free to use this definition without using any other aspect of rapid software testing if that's what you like. So hopefully that will head off some of the unproductive sorts of arguments. But, I don't think that humility requires me to accept idiocy, to accept bad work and bad thinking and people who are slovenly in their thinking. I don't have to smile and nod and say thank you for sharing like I'm in kindergarten or something. I think that this craft should expect more of itself. And one of the huge reasons, the biggest reason I think why, after all these years that there have been testers in the world, testing is still this poor little sister of the development process, is because testers in general have held themselves to such a low standard, have allowed there to be such bad thinking year after year in every conference. And so these conference people yell at me for yelling at their speakers and saying, you guys don't know what you're doing. But that's exactly the lack of this critique, which allows bad work to thrive year after year, and these rumors about what testing is, which are wrong, to not be challenged because people are too damn polite. So I don't mind if everyone's not polite, but I'm not going to be polite. Not me.
Well, I agree. There's humility does not translate to submissiveness. I mean, you can be assertive yet very humble about your position.
That's what I try to do. And sometimes I don't succeed in that. Sometimes I'm overwhelmed by a certain childishness, and and I just try to keep doing better, and I rely on my colleagues, my close colleagues, to rein me in when I've taken something too far.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. So this is great. I want to thinking about thinking again. There's a couple other things to ask about. You were mentioning just systems of thought, just as you would choose different schools of religion or different schools in a philosophical basis. If to drop the word DevOps into our conversation, it's also gotten a lot of buzz recently, and one of the tenets that those guys in continuous delivery or WebOps or the Jez Humbles and Gene Kims of the world have written things, and they incorporate one of the cornerstones outside of feedback loops and things. One of the things that they throw around casually, and I think all too casually, is systems thinking. And it's something that I know you write about and you actually teach about as well.
Right.
Are you familiar with sort of how DevOps is sort of twisting and bending this, extending or maybe abusing the term systems thinking versus what you teach?
Well, one of the disturbing things about DevOps for me, which isn't about DevOps, it's about the DevOps kind of phenomenon, I suppose,
Sure.
is that unlike previous development concepts, this particular community is quite insular and separated from my community. So I actually know very little about it.
Sure.
And I'm very nervous about that. I'd like to know a lot more about DevOps, but the problem with knowing more about DevOps is all I'm able to hear, because I'm so far away from that community, is rumors.
Sure.
If you give me a book on DevOps, I know that all I'm reading are rumors. That's what people write in books. They write rumors. What I need to see is day to day, what do people actually talk about? What do they actually do in a DevOps-oriented project? And I've never been close to a DevOps-oriented project. I want to be, but those kinds of people are probably not going to hire someone like me. And unless I'm hired, I probably can't afford to do that. And unlike Agile in general, I can't just do it myself. I can do TDD myself, and I've done that. I can run a little development project, and I've done that. Just my own things to get my own experiences. But DevOps is a large-scale thing. If I were to do a little tiny DevOps thing with little tiny release cycles, and I would not be getting the real experience of what it's like. I'm afraid that I can't say anything much about DevOps except one thing, and that is that those people don't study testing. They're not part of the testing community. And so when they want to replace testing, if that's what they want to do, when they want to incorporate testing and thinking like a tester, I have no idea whether they're successfully doing that or unsuccessfully doing that. I just have to shrug and say that's kind of a dark area for me. So I don't know what they're doing with systems thinking.
Yeah, and I think they're borrowing it from the interconnectedness, the breaking down silos.
Yeah, that whole breaking down silos thing, though, is something that drives me nuts. The stuff about often when I hear someone talk about breaking down silos, what they seem to be talking about is not having roles anymore.
Yeah, or
no one has a role on the team. And we're all just one big happy family.
Well, they call it piling on is the other thing they say. It's like, all right, there's a problem, let's just pile on. And I'm like, okay, you guys are extending the scrumming, the athletic metaphors go a little too far sometimes. So I'm like, no, let's not all pile on.
I suspect that's kind of represents a psychological preference, a temperament thing.
Yeah.
And I suspect that the temperament thing has to do with conflict avoidance, wanting there to be like, we shouldn't have arguments, we shouldn't have those uncomfortable conversations about everything should just be by vote or by spontaneous harmony,
or it's a pure democracy.
I can tell you to get good at something. I can tell you to get good at anything. To get good at anything, you have to focus on it, and to get really good. If you can get good at something and not focus on it, then you're not very good at it compared to someone who does.
Yeah, given the same raw talent. Yeah,
I can do graphics programming. I can do database programming. I can do physics stuff. But I don't. If I were going to do any of that stuff really well, I would have to buckle down and study. And if I did that, and if the people around me did not do that, well, then they better listen to me when I tell them how things have to go. I mean, of course, anyone can help me solve the problem, and I want to work with a team and solve problems together. But I think there's a lot of dangerous assumptions that are being made when people say, well, the method is the important thing, and the method is we should all work together and solve problems, when that method only works well if everyone is fantastically highly skilled. And you only can become fantastically highly skilled through lots and lots of practice. So in a practical reality of the kind that I've experienced in my years in development, some people are much better at certain things than other people are, and I want those people who are better at those things to be anchoring that activity. There are some people who are much better at database-oriented programming and configuration. Please have that person be in charge of that, and I'm sure I'll help them. I'm sure other people can help them. But let's have the person who's their local expert to focus on that instead of having everyone kind of poke around at it. I know as someone who I enjoy statistics, if I'm working with 5 other people to do statistical programming and none of them really like mathematics except me, I would go crazy trying to constantly correct their mistakes and to explain to them why it's important to understand numerical analysis and rounding errors and all that stuff when they want to just shrug and say, well, who cares really?
It's the same frustration I have in the performance world when somebody can't tell me what their standard deviation
I
is.
had a big argument with a guy recently about that where he was using averages and he had no idea what variation even meant. I said, well, what's the variance? And he told me something that sounded like he just knew the word variance from the dictionary, and he had no idea that there was such a thing as mathematical variance. And this was a guy who was using a spreadsheet to calculate the estimated numbers of test cases that it would take to test something, which is just a bizarre, unscientific astrology thing to do. And he had no idea. He thought it was somehow scientific because he was using a spreadsheet. And to me, that's just kindergarten nonsense. Anyway, when someone says break down silos, there's a part of that makes sense, and there's a part of that doesn't to me. The part that makes sense is not when we get rid of a specialty wherein I have studied and I know this area very, very well.
Right.
Instead, why don't we cut some windows? Put some windows in that silo. How about if I come out of my silo to a common area and I help other people? How about if I invited into their silo once in a while to help them without intimating that I'm an expert in that silo? I'm happy to leave my silo and help somebody in their silo, but that's not the same thing as removing the silos. I've worked very hard to be a testing expert. Yeah. And I enjoy being a testing expert, and I want to share my expertise with anyone else who's interested. I'm also a programmer. I'm happy to do programming, but I have not invested in being an artisan level programmer like I don't know who is Bob Martin. You know, I'm not. I haven't invested the way he has. I've invested in something different. I'm not going to be as good a programmer as Ward Cunningham, and I don't need to be. I'm happy that Ward Cunningham does that. I can be pretty good, but I'm just not willing to put in the work that it takes to be worthy of going to a development conference and lecturing other people on how to name their variables. Okay, I'm just not going to do that. But I'm happy. I am a programmer, and I'm happy to help people do programming, but I have a different silo that I am a part of. And, of course, I can invite people into my silo and say, help me test. And of course, I will go into their silo and help them program if they want me to. But the idea that we should not have silos is an idea that it just strikes me as childish.
It's very casual management type language. Like, I don't know how to solve the problem, so I'm just going to start.
It reminds me of a girl I argued with. She's I think she was 18 at the time, and she was an anarchist. And she was saying, we really shouldn't have any governments and any political systems. And I said, I think you'll feel differently once you have a family and a house and then you have stuff and you don't want people to take your stuff away. And she said, well, how dare you imply that it's just because of my age and inexperience that I don't know that my ideas aren't valid. Well, the problem is that age and experience actually do really matter. They really, really matter.
They change you, yeah.
And that's not to say that your ideas are invalid. But when you're talking about here's how life should be, and your entire perspective is never having had something precious to you that someone stronger can take away, you've got nothing to lose, well, then you really don't deserve the same consideration as people who have a more a longer and deeper experience of living. And I'm sorry, but that's the way it is. So this is why we don't elect 18-year-olds as presidents.
That's exactly right. But speaking of 18-year-olds, particularly those that seem to enjoy blogging on and on about DevOps and systems thinking, because there is somewhat of a generational difference, and there's some great senior talent that's done fantastic automation in the DevOps world. It's when they started throwing around this systems thinking that it's interesting to get your feedback, because I also know you teach systems thinking from a testing context as well. How do you teach it differently, with, I think, maybe more respect for the origins of interconnectedness from a scientific perspective?
Sure, yeah. I can tell you that for me, what systems thinking is about, well, not just for me, for anyone who I would consider serious about thinking about systems thinking, what systems thinking is about the diversity of ways of modeling any world that you want to talk about, any system you want to talk about. There's a diversity of ways of mapping that to symbols and forms and pictures. And based on how we look at something, we could come to vastly different conclusions about how to control it, about what it means, about whether it's a good or a bad instance of that. And so systems thinking is about learning to have variety, power, mobility in your ways of thinking about systems. And this is as opposed to non-systems thinking, I suppose, would be thinking that is based on one and only one model, one and only one system of thinking, without realizing that is not the only way, and may not necessarily the best way to go about it. I learned my approach to systems thinking from Jerry Weinberg's great book, Introduction to General Systems Thinking. That changed my life, it changed my career to read that book. And I recommend it to everyone. It's not a very easy book to read, but it is amazing in the insights that it brings forth. For me, it removed forever my sense that I had before that there was an intrinsically correct way to see things, an intrinsically correct way to think about things, that the correctness of perception was somehow built into reality. I no longer believe that. I no longer need that belief. I can operate completely without the need for certainty. without the need for one and only one best way of organizing my thoughts. I use lots of different ways of modeling things, and I use any particular way just like anyone else would, but I'm less likely to be trapped in that way, in that single way, my preferred way, which is why I talk about how there are no best practices. If the DevOps people are saying there are no best practices, that there's no one right way to do things, no way to know what is the best way to do things, but instead we use heuristics and we use our skill at seeing things in different ways to concoct local solutions at particular times that will work for us, and then we change them when they don't work for us anymore.
Right.
Well, then that would seem to me like a systems way of thinking, and if that's what they're doing, then great.
Yeah, and if they're embracing a diversity of models or a diversity of perspectives on different models on the same system of things or ideas or whatever, then they're not sort of taking a faddish, borrowing the term and pissing off Richard Feynman kind of approach to systems thinking. I thank you for actually bringing up that book. I will obviously share it with everyone, and I have not read it, so that sounds like a great place to start. Yeah,
you remind me that Richard Feynman said some not so flattery things about systems thinking. I think Richard Feynman, he's my idol. I love the guy. I've learned a lot from the writings and speeches of Richard Feynman, but I think he did casually dismiss things that sometimes that he didn't really understand. And maybe he was commenting on some of the bad implementations of it. And I do remember him saying something about how systems thinking seemed to be all kind of fluffy, and what good is it? Because Feynman kept coming back to where's the experiments? Do the experiments. Mm-hmm. He was immensely practical in that way. But I find that it is systems thinking is profoundly practical to a tester, to someone whose job it is not to be fooled. Someone whose job it is to look at things in a different way, which, of course, it was Richard Feynman's great gift to be able to look at things in different ways. Yeah. Maybe what he was complaining about are people who took systems thinking ideas and turned them into rules and then tried to use the rules to create new knowledge. And that's not what I do or what any reasonable systems thinker does.
Who's to know? Had he lived longer, his ideas around systems thinking and or any scientific thing would have evolved as well.
It could be.
You never know. I think one of the other tips that I give to folks who have on occasion asked me, different ways of making sense of systems thinking, I refer to them to the movie Mind Walk. Are you familiar with that movie?
What a lovely movie.
I love that movie. And it's more accessible to some people who are either more visual or into sort of passively taking in the information and then,
It's a great movie. I don't know where to get it, though. Is that on Netflix? I don't think it is.
It's very rare. We have it on VHS. I think it's the only reason I still have a VHS player is that film.
It's a great movie.
But it's that'd be great. We could keep talking on forever, but I promise you I'd turn you back less than an hour. And
I would challenge you on something, though.
Sure,
Mark. This happens nearly every time that I do an interview. Is here I am. I'm a tester. I teach testing.
Yes.
But we haven't actually dealt with any testing issues. We talked about the social world of software testers, which I love talking about. That's fine.
Agreed.
It'd be fun to actually discuss testing, and it may be that there's a good reason why we don't. It may be that in order to really get into the nuts and bolts, the interesting deep parts of testing, you couldn't do that in less than a 10-hour podcast to get into the nooks and crannies of a particular testing problem. But it is still something that frustrates me a little bit in that someone could listen to this whole thing and go, how do we even know he knows anything about testing? Because he hasn't actually – James Bach didn't say anything about testing. He just made pronouncements about other people. Ask me a testing problem.
Yeah, well,
I'm ready.
Okay, so the testing problem, I guess, that I had put to you is I believe James Bach will tell me something different if I ask him about systems thinking after he rants about ISTQB and Rex Black. And to be honest, my test was the test was I imagine that you may contradict yourself, which you did not. So my test to that extent failed because I thought there's an overlap in the interconnectedness, or as you started talking a little bit about determinism playing a role, that when people in building a model that lacks diversity and they tend to glue on to one view of the world, I still think there's the extemporaneous to expound upon a subject that invites people to think a little bit differently and putting that up against what you would call factory style, right? So there's still something interesting to me anyway in the finding to juxtapose a conversation on DevOps and systems thinking also versus ISTQB. So I wouldn't call it maybe not a very good test from my perspective.
There are lots of people who are confused about context driven because what they say is they go, well, okay, so if there's no best practice, then why are you espousing context-driven? Isn't that a practice? And I go, no, it's not a practice. Context-driven testing is a school of thought, not a practice. So I'm certainly free to say I believe this is a appropriate way to think about software testing without contradicting myself when I say that the appropriate way to think about software testing is not to become fixed on any one practice. And that's because the problems of software testing are always changing. But when we talk about context-driven testing as a school, that's not relating to a constantly changing problem. That's a level above all of the decisions about specific practices. But in other words, if I'm going to be properly scientific and someone says, well, science says that you need to entertain whatever thought it is that works. Science is what works, and we subject things to experiment and all that. So why don't astrophysicists allow astrologers to be in their conferences? Why don't surgeons allow faith healers to be in their conferences? Well, because the fact that we're open-minded does not require us to re-argue things that have been settled hundreds of years ago, unless there's some compelling new evidence to consider.
Yeah.
Anyway, next time, let's have a conversation where we talk about a testing problem. Let's ground this in an example. Okay? Well, we can talk about combinatorial testing or scenario testing or how to deal with a specific testing problem, because once in a while I like to do an interview that if someone listens to it, maybe they'll say, wow, that guy really knows a lot about testing, instead of just that guy sure is grumpy. Because that's what I think people will come out with if they listen to this podcast.
I think we went beyond we went beyond grumpy. We went into some other parts of the culture, which I think is still interesting. Yeah.
I don't mind being grumpy. It's a carefully cultivated reputation that I have for being angry. I want people to think of me as angry. That really helps me because it lowers the pressure on me when I meet people and I'm nicer than my reputation is.
Well, I think you've been very nice in our conversation. Maybe next time we can get into a good intellectual arm wrestling on that.
Okay.
But thank you very much for your time. Anything you'd like to maybe tell the community, inviting them to maybe some future classes or things you've got coming up? You're going to be in Europe, right?
Well, I would say that that you should all go to the Let's Test conferences. There's an upcoming one in September in Australia. I'll be there. I'm going to be at the Let's Test conference in Stockholm. I'll be doing a new kind of mini tutorial on the topic of observation, where I will be presenting some challenges in the art of observing things.
Oh, wait a minute. That's based on the book you've been reading, right?
Yeah, How to Use Your Eyes, right, by James Elkins, which is a very interesting book.
Very cool.
And I'm also, Michael Bolton and I are nearly finished with our new version of the Agile testing quadrants to try to correct all the mistakes in the old version that's out there.
That's awesome.
So we're going to do some kind of article or talk on that soon. So I guess that's all from my side of things.
Very cool. Thank you very much, and we'll catch up with you next time. Have some safe travels.
Thanks, Mark.